and thanks for joining us. We're kicking off the 6th and final session in our Transformation Brutal Truth series. As always, I'm Ben Dickey and part of the Hivemind team and host of the series, and looking forward to today's conversation on the change resilience crisis. Over the last 6 weeks, we've explored a variety of reasons that cause transformation programs to fail or stall, including human people challenges, technology issues, the shadow organization, and last week with David, we got into the illusion of value, and when we think we're making progress, have we lost sight of the outcomes? Today, we're going to do a session that's taking a more system-wide view and looking at the impact of change fatigue, not from the perspective of an individual, but the systemic inability to sustain transformation and high performance. So I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Catherine Hayes. Catherine was with us in the first session. She's an organisation resilience expert. She's the author of a book called Transition Leadership, and she's got decades of experience working across finance, healthcare, public sector, and professional services, helping leaders in organisations to deliver transformation in a sustainable way, preserving the energy and ownership and helping to drive high performance across individual teams and whole organisations. So good morning, Catherine, welcome.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for the invitation.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. Catherine, I've no doubt, because we've spoken a number of times over recent weeks, you've got some fantastic stories to share with us from your experience. I wanted to give us an opportunity really to kick off and look at, from your experience, what the key and core principles are of resilient organisations.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, but it's something that we know, but it's something that gets frequently kind of overlooked in lots of ways. But the only constant we've got in this environment is change, and the only certainty is uncertainty. And yet somehow we're still not building those capabilities. As people are growing up, as people are in schools. I wish we could teach some of this to children when they were in school. But another factor around this, and again, I've been saying this for years, is we can't manage change. I remember talking to the people that set up the Change Management Institute and said, can you call it something else? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you can't manage change. And they said, don't be so stupid. I said, no, you can manage programs and projects, but if change is constant, how can you manage change? The other factor that gets frequently overlooked is that change is a linear left to right pathway. And the levels of complexity that we're all involved in and all engaged with is actually, as I uncovered many years ago, it's a process of transcendence. Change is like walking up a spiral staircase. It's we can see one piece at a time, but as as you know, when we're at the bottom of the spiral staircase, we can't see right to the top. So it is about how we engage with that process, how we uncover things when we're going and how we're emerging, and paying attention to the things that emerge as we're starting to walk up that staircase. Another key factor, again, this is not, in our Western society around ambiguity. Ambiguity is ambiguity. It's the nature of a relationship that we have with ambiguity that makes a difference in relationship to how we engage with constant change. And, and last but not least, these days, no one person can know everything and have all of the answers like they used to do many years ago. We're in a very, very different society. We look at the levels of complexity that there are in businesses. When I started my career, finance was finance. Now you look at how many different factors there are in finance. IT is another classic. How many different types of experts do you have within that IT context? So we're dealing with a world that is becoming more and more and more complex, that's facilitated by technology, basically.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think one of the things that working with our clients over the last 4 or 5 years, to your point around change is constant. We're working more and more with organisations that are running what they call, or what we call, multiple transformation programs concurrently, and I have to say, well, just not just anecdotally, but certainly through recent conversations, it feels like every change initiative is getting harder and harder the more change organisations try and put through their system. Why do you think that is?
Again, it's not taken from a systemic point of view. So many what you're talking about there is what I call transition overload, that they don't look at, because the system is fragmented. You have HR, you have finance, you have IT. What's not looked at systemically is what levels of complexity are you asking that whole system to have to evolve to adopt. You might have HR coming in with a new restructuring. You might have IT coming in with new tech systems. You might have a new regulatory requirement that's having to bring in different systems, different processes. If, depending on where you are in the organization, you're going to be on the receiving end of multiple types of transitions that people completely overlook. How many different types of transitions are you asking people to adopt to? How many different types of ways of reframing, reshaping, reforming are people on the receiving end of? But because it gets split out into these different types of buckets, makes me laugh when people talk about people change, process change, technology change. It's like bunny rabbits, pussycats, and AI are not running organizations. People are. So it doesn't matter what type of change you're on the receiving end of, your people are having to adapt to constant, multiple different shapes and forms of these transitional journeys that get completely overlooked.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really valid point. Brings us on to, I guess, the processes or the practices and the mechanisms that organizations typically we see deploying to help manage these unknowns and these constant changes.
Absolutely. I think, I'm seeing more of this. When I started my career, there was a lot more around this need to control. Our Western mindsets are very much around this thing that we can control the universe. But the more levels of complexity people are on the receiving end of in organizations, the more we're starting to see these leaning into these control bias practices as a way of mitigating risk. It's a way of doing things. The piece that's becoming quite interesting is that you're still seeing, if we look at all of the events that we've had so far in the whole series, everything that people have been talking about the dynamics that are happening as a result of strategy created at the top by exec leaders, or in large corporate organizations by a strategy team. That then is then rammed down the throat of the workforce, which in itself, then you start to get different horizontal and vertical silos in a system. So as a consequence, you get this dynamic of splitting. Then, as a way of trying to make sure the stuff don't go off different shapes and forms of around practices, leaders start practicing more of these hierarchical and control ways of mitigating risk. And then obviously we go right back round full circle to what used to be called, when I started my career, which was the one throat to choke model, which was a risk model. So if you hold individuals to account, if an individual doesn't deliver, then it can be taken out, use a risk mitigation strategy, and then they can be replaced. But these practices are still being manifested because people are not developing those resilient capabilities for working with complexity and ambiguity, and not knowing, so they're leaning into more and more of these controls. And you're looking at things like, when you see industry regulators now, the more and more of these regulations start coming in, the more they're kind of unconsciously encouraging organizations to be more control, risk mitigation focused. And of course, as you point out there, you get these unintended consequences. When strategy is delivered at the top and it's executed, then really it's only owned by the senior leaders. There's no, people don't feel connected to it. It's that, well, their strategy, what are they doing? How are they doing? That in turn generates facilitated, fragmented, disconnected systems. As we were just saying earlier, if you're not looking at the organization as an integrated system, then things are going to be incredibly fragmented, expensive. I was working with a large global financial organization last year, and they were £2.5 billion over budget in terms of their infrastructure costs.
Wow.
And it was to do with, they didn't have the integrated system because of everything had been, dealt with in that context. As a consequence to that, people were fearful because of the way in which the leaders were trying to control. And we saw Trump's school of leadership. We saw, in some dynamics, Hitler's school of leadership, of telling people what they could say, what they could do. That in turn facilitated low trust and politics. In the last couple of sessions, particularly with Indrid, talking about the things that go on behind the surface.
The shadow organization.
Absolutely, and the various different conversations that happen, the sideline conversations that happen. These are basically the root causes of what drives it.
And just to shine a light on, without obviously naming the organisation, you talked about a huge overspend in terms of the operating infrastructure. It wasn't immediately obvious to me how that came about. Was that through the horizontal and vertical silos, and how the organisation and leadership had set that up? Absolutely.
So they built their infrastructure around an expert-based culture. So lots of experts, lots of different people with brains the size of the planet, all really brilliant, great, okay. But as a consequence, they hadn't built the integrated performance and talent and performance infrastructures. So you had a lot of people being paid a lot of money, but somebody, for example, who'd been there like 20 years and they keep delivering, were they industry leaders, or were they just the fact that they've been there 20 years? Do you need all of those different resources? So when your system's joined up and and you understand how the system is functioning, do you need all of those really expensive resources? How when your systems then are not joined up, where you have, you might be looking at finance, but every department had its own finance function. So you had finance being replicated in multiple shapes and forms throughout the different business units, when actually one central finance system that you're going completely from end to end right the way across the system, that would have things joined up. You don't need 5 different finance systems for 5 different business units that you've got. So it was this, everything was kept repeating itself in multiple shapes and forms, basically.
Got it. No, that's helpful clarification. Thank you. So as we have done throughout the series, we're really keen to invite your insights and participation. I've definitely worked in environments with those types of structures and individual accountabilities, for sure. Keen to hear from our audience today on how the need for certainty and control shows up in organisations either that you're working in today or that you've worked in the past. Which of the 4 practices Catherine's highlighted have you seen most frequently in either your current organisation or recent roles? And we'll give everybody 30 seconds to work through those. Seems like the control leadership is leading. Is the standout answer that people that's resonating most with the audience, and I guess, Catherine, that's probably born out of the fact that that's where most people's interaction with the organisation, our most frequent interaction in the organisation, is with direct leadership.
It is. It's also one of the unintended consequences around organisations having leaders who are experts in their particular field.
Okay.
So you might have somebody who's the head of IT, for example, who've been promoted into the head of IT role, not on their capabilities for leading IT, but on their capabilities of being a technical expert. And quite often you get many, again, that organisation I gave the example of, when I started working with some of the COOs of the different business units, they were all very much there based on their technical expertise of how they developed their career.
Yeah.
Quite frequently, you will get people and experts, they like using their technical knowledge to mitigate risks in a business. So they naturally, unconsciously leaning into being more control orientated on the back of, that's a risk. By using my technical knowledge to mitigate that risk, they don't see, because the infrastructure, then the talent and the performance infrastructure hasn't been built, and people haven't been supported to make those transitional shifts in their careers from being a practitioner to a team leader, to a department leader, to an executive leader. They're fundamentally different capabilities and frameworks that these transitional shifts get frequently overlooked. So you end up with these large organizations, or many organizations, being led by the technical capabilities of experts, not experts in business leadership.
Absolutely. So we've talked about some of the practices that would be, I guess, inhibitors to change resilience. And as always in this series, we want to shine a light on what can be done differently, or really what good looks like. So when you talk about in your practice around sustainability and change resilience, this that we're sharing on screen is I guess how you see it done well, and how high performing organizations become more change resilient.
Absolutely. I mean, when strategy is co-created, a thing that frequently gets overlooked is, how does a system work? How is an organization functioning? Quite often you can get, when the strategy is created purely by the exec level or even the strategy team, there can be parts of things that are going on in the system that are either real strengths and levers that can help you either initiate that strategy even quicker, or contribute to making, more leading edge products and services. But if you don't know what you don't know, and you don't understand what they are, what are those strengths in the organization, you can't leverage it. Equally, if you don't understand what the root causes are of the challenges, how are you going to mitigate those challenges in terms of getting over and working through them? So when it's co-created, when the senior execs and the strategy teams invite feedback from the workforce, and they invite constantly looking at how the system is functioning, that strategy is aligned, but it's also collectively owned. Of course, that in turn, that data, that way of working, enables the organization to build integrated systems, so that you can see how these things come together. The classic one we see is, how our purpose is not facilitated throughout the organization. Again, that example I gave you just now, that organization didn't know the difference between a purpose and a strategic intent. As a consequence, people went off with their own view, doing their own thing in their own different ways. So when that's owned and it's collectively owned, and you've got mutual leadership, you've got that integrated infrastructure, leaders can facilitate mutuality, collective ownership. They can facilitate ways of bringing people on board and co-creating that whole way of working in the environment, which then means you get the collective accountabilities. So, the classic thing of what happened in the financial services industry with the whole LIBOR was the fact that there wasn't collective accountability. So people just went off doing their own things in their own ways, trying to generate revenue so they would get a bigger bonus.
Yeah.
So there's that element of when you get that collective accountability, that in itself facilitates mutual practices, in itself facilitates interconnected systems, in itself means the whole system is joined up and connected and aligned. Of course, by just fun places to work.
And I can see how in smaller organizations where you've got smaller teams who are maybe naturally much closer in proximity to the CEO or the board and the people leading the business, fascinated to get through the I guess the key pillars of sustainability and change resilience, and look at how that's possible how that's possible to achieve in larger organizations like the ones that you've worked with.
Again, it is about how you bring these factors into play. And what I uncovered and discovered was basically there were three. So one is about having depth and understanding in terms of operational functioning. How is this organization, how is this department, how is this division functioning? What is the kind of the capabilities and the mindsets that are informing it? What are the practices and processes that are happening? What are the dynamics informing the performance and culture? I mean, culture, for example, is just repeated patterns of thinking and behavior. The question is what informs it? What are those patterns of repeated patterns of thinking and behavior? And what is informing it? What's falling into it? Another factor is around the transition leadership practices. Again, what we were just talking about. Surprising how many leaders these days in organizations don't see leading change as part of their role. They chuck it over the fence to the PMO. PMO does change. Don't see what part that they in themselves, how are they responding to change? Basically, if they can't lead themselves, they can't lead others. If they can't lead others, they can't lead a business. And so there's that element of what are those transition leadership capabilities and practices that facilitate it. And then last but not least, which is this whole area around the transitional space, not knowing, not understanding what are those different factors and dynamics that come into play, and having that knowledge, having depth of knowledge, having insight, knowing how to work with ambiguity, and working with those factors and building those resilient capabilities are absolutely key. When I worked at Morgan Stanley, I was there for 10 years. Parts of our business, we had integrated all of these factors. And when you started to look at the factors of the businesses that were aligned to it, their revenues were going through the roof, 40, 50%. So
Wow.
very different context.
And I think, as you've said earlier on, that starts with making sure the purpose of the organisation is really well articulated and then really effectively communicated across all levels of the organisation, all functions, silos, and capabilities.
Absolutely, and also knowing and understanding how the systems inform each other. So we'll go back to the classic of the LIBOR example in the financial services industry. Because they didn't build the integrated talent and performance infrastructure, and the reward system was aligned, and you didn't have that collective ownership, the reward system drove individuals going off, doing their own thing, just trying to generate revenue. It was funny, before LIBOR kicked off, I was invited into, again, another large global financial organization to understand why is it that people wouldn't take risks. Well, because they had a fear-based culture, because they were on their own and they didn't want to go off and take risks because they didn't know what the implications of it were going to be. Of course, then when the LIBOR thing kicked in, we could see the system was fragmented. We didn't have purpose alignment. The leaders didn't know what they didn't know about what were the practices that they needed to do to create that safe, supportive context. The strategy was executed. So of course, you're looking at it, and this is a great example of what happens when purpose isn't embedded throughout the system. You know, in practice, when you've got a high-performing organization that is sustainable and change resilient, there is no ambiguity inside that organization. or complexity. In practice, the only place where ambiguity and complexity exist is in the external environment. But if you have an embedded purpose into the system, so we take the classic example, Walt Disney's purpose is to make people happy. If I'm running a team of costume designers in Walt Disney, then the purpose of it is to make costumes for the products that make people happy. Okay. If I'm the person that is designing some of those costumes, the purpose of my role is to design costumes in relationship to the costumes for the products and making people happy. Really clear, no ambiguity. But what gets frequently overlooked, and again, that example I gave about that organization that didn't know the difference between a purpose and a strategic intent, was that it hits on people go off, they don't know where to put their focus. We can use this as a classic example. What am I supposed to do? Where do I fit in terms of my activity? How come when I look at my contribution, how can and my difference and my contribution be valued? So that's just one question at the individual level. You take that up a level in terms of a team. If I don't know that, question then is this a group of individuals or is this a collective team? How can I connect? How can I co-create? How can I work with my colleagues? How can we work together? I don't know. No, I think I'll just lean back in. I don't know what I'm doing. Not sure what they're doing. I'll just focus on my own area. Of course, then when you're looking at functions, divisions, then it's like, what's the purpose of this function? What are we doing? How can we connect and work together? How can we collect? How can we take care of clients? Who are our clients? Don't know, not sure. So this is a classic. This is just one area where organizations can mitigate a lot of risk and a lot of complexity when that's embedded throughout the system. We take the example of that organization I was saying. Were that purpose embedded throughout the organization, they wouldn't be over budget in terms of their infrastructure costs because it would be clear what resources they needed, where they needed it. If something is really simple as well, when purpose is embedded, if something's in alignment with the purpose, you put your energy and your effort into working with it. If it's a problem, sorting it out. If it's not in alignment with the purpose, you don't do it. You don't go anywhere near it. Our purpose, don't do it.
And I think it's it's really clear and simple when you talk it through like that and you connect the value chain of the organization to the purpose. Also I guess the more layers and the larger organizations grow in scale, it's also easy to see how that small disconnects can lead to large diversions over time.
Absolutely.
One of the most fascinating elements of the practice, Catherine, for me is on this next slide, the transition leadership practice, and I'm mindful of time. If you can talk us through how you came about this really quickly and the sort of the leading impact of embracing this.
Sure. I mean, it is really simple. If we don't know what we don't know about ourselves, how can we create a supportive environment for others? If we can't create a supportive environment for others, how are we going to translate ideas into practical reality? But it's surprising how these three core capabilities, if a leader doesn't know how to engage with complexity and ambiguity, how they respond to it, how they work with it, how are they going to be able to support others to mitigate risks and support them to work with ambiguity? How are they going to facilitate teams to work together to do it? If you can't facilitate and support others and teams to do it, how are you going to do that for the business? If, again, we're going back to that example, if you don't define purpose and strategy, both for your business, for your change programs, again, being pulled in lots of times with change programs, I say, what's the purpose of this change? And I don't get a very clear, straightforward answer, or I might get 4 or 5 different answers. That's, again, these are core practices. So it's really simple and straightforward. If we can't lead others, we can't lead the business. But we also need to understand and know ourselves And how do we respond to not knowing and ambiguity?
Yeah, sure. And I think that the point you raised earlier around individuals climbing the ladder, so to speak, and ending up in leadership or executive roles without the companion support, really, and the capability enhancements of understanding what those executive leadership roles require versus the individual contributor or senior manager type roles. And then the last component of the practice is around the change resilience infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's surprisingly how overlooked this is, because again, people tend to focus on change methodologies. Or change, you know, it's a methodology is how you lead basically programs and projects. It's not an embodied practice of how do you work with ambiguity and complexity. I was talking to a client who'd trained in the ADKAR capability, and when they started talking about things like change resistance and saying, well, how do we work with that? Because then what mitigates it? They said, don't look at that, don't focus on that. Just, which is, you know, really these change methodologies are program and project management practices. So it's transitioning into being more resilient. Classic one I built and it works a lot is how do you establish and build transition support teams? Sometimes they're full-time and they're part of the project management function. Sometimes they're part of large-scale programs and projects, so they can be very different. But it's also about how do you leverage and build those resilient capabilities. Classic one, how much time and effort is spent in gaining insight and understanding how something functions and works before you even try to change it. What are the levels of complexity that are going to be involved and going to need to be honored in terms of how that system is functioning? What is the ambiguity that's there? And how do you mitigate that ambiguity? How do you work with it? And the practices then for working with transcendence and the practices for working with those levels of complexity. When we can build those practices and capabilities in, it's a frame of reference. As I say, clients tell me all the time, once we know, we couldn't not know, but it also changes our way we embody it. It changes our way of doing things. And it means we don't fail anymore because we're embodying and honoring the multiple levels of complexity in the system.
And when you're talking to individuals or organizations about change resilience, what's one of the most common misconceptions that people have?
That it's a methodology as opposed to an embodied practice. It's a thing that they do, like a project plan, as opposed to when you know, hang on a minute, we have to look at something before we even try to think about how big's that gap. It becomes a thing, and this is what a lot of clients say, is once we know what we didn't know, we cannot not know it. So it means then that you get things like people can't swim in the river of Egypt in terms of the leadership teams start blaming the project managers for not delivering on things. It means that leaders that then can start seeing, what are we doing to support our environment? What are we doing to support our workforce? What are we doing to engage people? What are the levels of complexity? So it's really that the factors they see it. It's not like a project plan. It's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of engaging with it.
Okay, thanks for that, Catherine. So now we've talked through the three core elements of sustainability and change resilience. Really, excited and interested to hear from our attendees today, thinking about your organisation if you're in the middle of a transformation programme, or thinking wider about the whole business as a system. Which of those three pillars of sustainability and change resilience would make the biggest impact on your organisation's transformation outcomes or on business performance. Better understanding or building sustainable infrastructures, or organization design, understanding roles of individuals, teams in the context of the wider organization, developing the transition leadership capabilities and practices, or creating the resilient change infrastructures. Looks like leadership is in the spotlight again, based on the answers coming through so far. From your perspective, Catherine, we'll have project and program leaders as well as exec leaders of functions or leaders of organizations on the call with us this morning. If those leaders want to, having listened to some of this stuff, recognizing some of the symptoms in the organization or some of the unforeseen consequences, what's one thing that they could take away from this and put in place tomorrow, or start to focus on tomorrow?
It is about engaging with understanding what are the levels of complexity involved in a transformation process. How is something working now? How big's that gap between where you are and where you want to be going? Because if you don't know what you don't know about how something is functioning, and this is the same for individuals, teams, and organizations, you can't really think through how are you going to help prepare that system? How are you going to help prepare teams? How are you going to help supporting them through something when you don't know how big that gap is? We used on the first example, the first workshop, we were talking about that system of a rostering system that got completely overlooked. They'd invested time and energy to understand that rostering system was way bigger than it was, and what they saw, it would have been a very different impact.
Okay. Well, as we're close to time, and as always, we're really keen to hear any questions from the audience on the material that you've seen today. Any support, or you'd like to pick Catherine's brains on how to build those change resilient capabilities, or looking at leadership and leadership transitions. If you're in a role and transitioning from senior leader up to exec, how you manage that personal transition, or manage I think the transition teams. For me, Catherine, and the role that they can play in organizations that are going through either change or transformation programs, or managing constant change, is something. If we don't have any questions from the audience, I'd love to hear a little bit more about.
No questions. Sure.
Looks like no questions. It must have been a really clear and well-described description of the practice.
Yeah, I mean, transition teams, like I say, they can be part of a program. So you can set them up purely for the program. You can set them up for supporting PMOs, because again, what gets overlooked is quite often PMOs get accused of not taking people on a journey, not helping people to understand the levels of complexity, because PMOs tend to be funded quite a lot by project managers, program managers, and they drive that change. So the whole primary purpose of a transition team is to support the organization, or whatever it is you're trying to change, is to support that to make those transitional shifts. So it's creating that supportive environment.
We've just had a question come through.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut across you, Catherine, from Eva, and if we can get it in time.
Eva
would like to hear, how do you bring leadership on board with transformation programs when they're a bit lost in a wider whirlwind of demand? So I guess that's how do we get sufficient time and attention with with the execs focusing on those transformation programs
My
while still in business as usual.
My experience with this is going and telling them about what the risks are likely to be if they don't have the support. So again, with the transition team, you go and you say to the leaders, right, we'd like some support in your sponsorship and supporting people to look at this. We've done the analysis. We've looked at the challenges that people are going to need to mitigate. We've looked at the gaps. This is where we need support. So where you can help support us is saying, look, this is going to be a challenging thing to integrate this new technology. What it's going to do for us? What are the implications that are going to be done for us? So it really is being proactive with the leaders and inviting the leaders to come on board to support it, because I also kind of really position it from a point of view of the risk, which is, if your people are not going to buy this process, then this is going to be where the implications are, and this is going to be where the challenges are for you and your business. Mm-hmm. So it is about partnering with those leaders and helping them see how they can get out of their own ways and how you can be more efficient and effective with their business and what you do. We've got another question there I can see.
Thanks for that, Catherine. Yeah, one last question as we're running out of time. A high-level walkthrough of how you've practically taken this into implementation for an organisation, and I think the next slide might help with some of the steps that are involved and some of the activities where you've done this.
Yeah, so sometimes it can be we go in, we do some insight diagnostics to help them to see how the system is functioning, how it's working. Once they get that data, it's really clear what are the strengths that you can leverage, what are the things that will need to be addressed, looked at, and having insight diagnostics, again, as I said, once you know, you cannot not know, and this applies to the workforce. It also, what it gets over the hurdle of is any kind of resistance, because what it helps the organisation to do is people feel as though they're being part of the system because they're being asked for their feedback, they're being asked for input. So we take a classic of let's do a diagnostic, let's look at how the system is functioning, invite the feedback from the workforce, then support leaders, and as part of that process, you obviously the leaders get feedback in terms of how are their capabilities. Because another question I have frequently with leaders: do you know the implications of your leadership practices are having on the performance of your business or your organisation? Quite often, no. Then when you get those practices back, let's start looking at: do you need to build an integrated talent infrastructure? Do you need to help leaders to make those transitional shifts? So again, helping them see if the feedback is that you've got Trump School of Leadership and control leadership practices, it's then helping the leaders to see what that looks like, helping the leaders to make those transitional shifts, helping the leaders to know and understand themselves as individuals, as teams, then help them to build their resilient capabilities, and then obviously building the transition teams to support that. So you're helping the system to know and understand itself. You're helping teams to know and understand where are their strengths, where are their challenges. You're helping the leaders to know and understand where are their strengths, where are their challenges. And then you're helping the system to develop the capabilities, the resilient capabilities, and or the infrastructures for doing it. So it's really those three slides. It's understanding the system, understanding the functioning, looking at the alignment with these factors, and then building the capabilities and the infrastructure that you need to help make it work.
Fantastic, Catherine. Thanks for that very detailed and relatively rapid, quick walk through how that can be done in practice. I know when we spoke before kicking off, you very kindly offered to have a one-to-one session with any of the attendees or participants on the session today if they wanted to dive in deeper into one of the three areas or across the piece. So Taryn or Eva or others on the call, if you want to take Catherine up on that offer, you can get in touch with a member of the Hivemind team and we'll get that set up. Other than that, I think all there is left for me to say is thank you to Catherine for a fascinating talk through sustainability, change resilience, and transition leadership. I've thoroughly enjoyed the session, and thank you to all of our attendees for spending the time with us, not just this week, but over the last 6 weeks. We will follow up with a roundup of the brutal truths of transformation. We'll make sure you get access to all of that content, and all of the 6 sessions are currently available for replay on the Hive Mind site. So on that note, thanks, and have a fantastic rest of your Friday. And do get in touch if we can help you overcome some of the challenges in your transformation programs. Thanks, Catherine.